Okay, I believe we are live. I never know
Yes.
because the bar's always kind of loading funny, but welcome everyone to another Record Live. It's Thursday afternoon, and this afternoon we have our third installment in a special series we've been doing on the Adventist Record Facebook page. Now, if you've tuned in previous weeks, you will have seen Jared and myself have the privilege of interviewing John Boston from the US, who gave us a US perspective on this Black Lives Matter movement 2 weeks ago. And then last week, we had the pleasure of interviewing Darren Garlett, the AUC ATSIM director, and Terry Casares, who's an academic on Aboriginal rights and things like that in Australia. But this week, the third in a trifecta, is that what they call it? Trilogy?
Yeah.
We have the wonderful Bal Kama here joining us, Dr. Bal Kama. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mel, and Jared. I'm pleased to be here and pleased to be part of the conversation on this important topic.
Yeah, definitely. It's a privilege to have you here. And today, if you haven't seen by the title, we're going to be delving into racism and inequality and justice in a Pacific Islands context. Now, this is really relevant because the South Pacific Division, which Adventist Record is, the magazine of, is very multicultural. It's one of the most multicultural divisions of the Adventist Church in the world. But before we delve into some of those big questions and issues, Bal, would you just like to introduce yourself, what you do, a bit about your family?
Sure. So Bal Kama is my name, as Mel has mentioned. So I have a background in politics, international relations, law. I've just completed my PhD in law at the Australian National University. And I'm based in Canberra as a lawyer and also as an academic. Part of my research is looking at issues in the Pacific, law and justice sectors, and looking at how the country has came from where it has been. So looking at the experience of colonization and of the past systems that have shaped and influenced Pacific Islands. And I guess I am pretty much involved in many of the much more modern contemporary issues that are implicating Pacific, but also happening here in Australia and New Zealand in terms of the conversations around it. And I tend to publish from time to time. I put out my opinions and comments on various media forums about issues. So I think this is a good time to be involved, I suppose, with an issue that is going global, but also having implications in the Pacific Islands, historically and to some extent presently.
Yeah, Bal, it's really good that you can join us. And as Mary Ellen said, probably more than 80% of our division is actually membership in the islands in the Pacific. So that's Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, the Polynesian, French Polynesia and Cook Islands, and all of those different beautiful islands in the Pacific. And so, it's important for us as the South Pacific Division to remember that we have a lot of membership in those places. And so, Bal, I thought we could start today's conversation by just exploring, these movements that we're seeing globally, the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that have happened both here in Australia and New Zealand and also around the world. How does that movement look to a Pacific Islander, someone from a Pacific Island background? What does it mean? How are you feeling about some of the issues that are brought up, the racism and the systemic injustices that some of these people are marching against? How does the Pacific worldview collide or go along with some of these issues, these important topics?
I think the movement that we have seen going across US and pretty much having an influence globally at this stage, it is bringing a sense of consciousness in the Pacific people at this stage and really asking them to look at their systems, their past, and how some of the injustices that they have faced as well. And then also, I guess, allowing them to now ask some questions within their own systems, within the institutions that they're subject to. So governments or churches or aid agencies or bilateral relations with other countries. I think Pacific Islanders are asking the question, are we also being marginalized? Are we also being unfairly treated? So I think the Floyd protest in the US is having a larger impact of really giving a sense of awakening in people across the Pacific.
Now, some of these countries that we're talking about, Bal, are now sovereign nations. You know, they've gained independence. They're not under the colonial powers as such anymore, and the majority of people in many of these nations are the people of the nation. So they're not necessarily minorities as others are in that an American context, and also in an Australian context. We have minorities who might feel marginalized or persecuted. But how do we see some of these racist things, racism, these systemic injustices, how do they impact some of these Pacific countries then?
Yes, no, I do agree in that they're not a minority within their own country. They're in fact the majority. They are the, I guess, the owners of their own countries.
Yes.
I suppose the sense of awakening that is coming from this recent movement is to look back into history. I think the first thing is to look at history and say, look, how have we been treated? And so it is awakening some sense of interest in revisiting that past and saying, you know, have we made right with the wrong in the past? Mm-hmm. And then bringing to the present, I think it is bringing that consciousness to the current population, to the current people of those countries, saying, you know, there is a sense of power imbalance here when we deal with other countries. When we are dealing with, let's say, international agencies, or if we're dealing with companies overseas, do we have these advantages or disadvantages that we can now look into, really rectify and also see where we've been, in a way, you know, undermined or unfairly isolated, I suppose. So I think the broader sense of justice that is brought about by this movement is really speaking to the Pacific people who have been feeling that they've been somehow unfairly, I guess, positioned in many other sectors. I think the other thing that it also brings an awakening to the Pacific is asking the question of, you know, who else in the Pacific Islands or across the region is being treated in such a way that needs their voice to be heard. And you know, that to me, I can see many, you know, across social media raising issues about, say, West Papua, for instance.
Yes.
People are saying, hey, we have our own brother and sisters out across in West Papua who are crying for justice, who are Pacific people. And so, you know, can we also defend their justice, their right to justice and their right to a fair, I guess, fair outcome of the cause that they've been fighting for. I think that's quite important in that it is making that awareness Pacific-wide.
A lot of our viewers may not know anything about West Papua. Can you give us a brief sort of nutshell overview of what that situation entails?
Sure. I think the historic facts are quite disputed. It's a very contentious situation in that the history is that the West Papua people, in fact, they're just up across the border from Papua New Guinea.
Yes.
And they look like a Melanesian person. They in no way look like an Indonesian, for that matter. But going back into history, an independent vote was taken by the UN when the Dutch and Portuguese, when they were looking after the areas within those places. When they left, they allowed the UN to take a vote asking the West Papuans whether they want to be part of the Indonesia country as a sovereign state, or do they want to be independent, or do they want to be separate? And I think the vote at the time was that they voted to become part of Indonesia. But what came out of that later on was that there is allegations that Indonesia actually forced those people who voted to actually vote in favor of Indonesia. And so that has resulted in that movement in West Papua ever since that vote was taken, and lives were being lost. There was a civil war currently going on, has been going on for some years, in the call to become independent, to become a Melanesian state, not an Indonesian state, or part of Indonesia. And I think that appeals to the Melanesian people because they could see that this is a call, or this is from a people that they can, relate to.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I'm going to be honest. When this Black Lives Matter movement, happened, say a month ago, I did notice there was a lot more news articles about both, the Indigenous perspective and the Pacific Islands perspective just on news websites. And I thought that was great, all these issues coming to the fore. But then Jared actually sent me an article on the West Papuan conflict, and I didn't even know that it was happening. And I watch the news most nights, but in what other ways are people like myself ignorant to the injustice that's happening? What are some tangible things that you can list that are happening, either that Western Australians are placing on Pacific Islanders, or they're just sort of ignorance is held by us?
I think, and it's a good point that you raise, in that we here in Australia are not, the mediums that influence our conversations. Those mediums are not transporting the issues in the Pacific Islands, issues in West Papua, or issues that matters to the near neighbors that we claim family. Australian government official stance on Pacific is that Pacific is a family. But we are not doing much in terms of bringing the issues of our family to our screens, to our homes, and to our conversations on dinner table. And I guess the only time that we bring those issues up is when something really bad happens. And so the image that Australian audience and New Zealand audience have of Pacific Islands is that when there's killings, or when there's things that is unlawful, or things that appear that the society is out of order, then it becomes a news for us.
Right.
And so
a cyclone, or a natural disaster. That's the image we have of the Pacific, that there's a problem happening that needs help from outside to fix.
Yes, good point there. Yes, so we have a view of a problematic Pacific,
right?
Instead of a partner Pacific, instead of a family Pacific, you see. And I think the more we do that, I fear their future generations will continue to perpetuate the negativity, and therefore undermining the intelligence, undermining that capacity, undermining the sovereignty, and I guess the humans of the Pacific. because we
Yes.
can box them up into a problem Pacific. So I think, yeah, there's a lot to be done in changing or reimagining how we put the image of Pacific into Australian and New Zealand homes.
Yeah, definitely. I think that sort of leads on to this idea of Australia or New Zealand providing aid to the Pacific. I know that this week I was writing an article about ADRA providing $1.7 million to Pacific countries in light of Cyclone Harold in April, right? But does that create this, as you're sort of referring to, this imbalanced dynamic? Like, what are some of the pros about that, and what are some of the cons that we don't necessarily address with that sort of a system?
I think the taxpayers of Australia and New Zealand have been, I guess, kind in a way to the government to allow aid to go to Pacific Islands. Without aid, we can fairly say that without aid, many of the Pacific countries wouldn't have progressed much in many sectors. So aid from both government and non-government organizations, like the ADRA and the others out there, they have been having a much more transformational effect on Pacific, and that Pacific is very, very grateful of that. On the other hand, obviously, persistent aid allows for a society to be dependent.
Right.
And so it does ask the question, when can independence really be realized? When can a society become self-sufficient? Persistent aid also allow the leaders of the countries to be less innovative in finding ways to support their communities. Persistent aid also means that local sense of sufficiency and sense of resilience is also undermined, because it paints a picture that these countries are aid dependent, and without aid, their survival is almost in peril. So I think while aid is playing an important part in all sectors, the question is to be asked, are we making a progress towards creating a self-sufficient Pacific, self-sufficient countries who can. Now, that said, I'm also mindful that some countries don't have the capacity to become self-sufficient. So, smaller countries like Tuvalu or Kiribati or Nauru, compare that to bigger countries like Papua New Guinea, who's got a vast amount of gold, oil, and all these natural resources that they are having billions coming in. I think that dynamic really tells us that some countries do need aid to function, whereas others, perhaps you can move towards a more self-sufficient, independent state. And I think that's where the current Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, Prime Minister James Marape, who is a Seventh-day Adventist church member, he's pushing towards an economic self-sufficiency for the country, because he can see the potential. But we are yet to see, I guess, the full extent of that. But as I've said, there are different countries at different wavelength, and therefore in need of different degree of help.
What about Bal, the situation in the church? Because you've mentioned some things there that are sort of that too much aid or too much assistance might stifle innovation and that sort of thing. But then the church has a similar system where a conference is organized and self-sufficient and viable, whereas a mission is not. And many of our Pacific islands in the South Pacific Division are still missions, known as mission conferences. And how do some of those issues play out there? And are we in danger of viewing what happens in the islands in an inferior way? I'm speaking through an Australian lens from a Western context, because of I guess, the extra help that the mission might need at this stage?
That's an interesting question, Jared. I think many of the missions in the Pacific, one of the ongoing conversations that I have in some quarters with some of the church leaders there is, should the missions also become self-sufficient? Can they support themselves in different ways other than offerings and tithes? And I think the examples that we see here in Australia is that many of our conferences have some business bodies. You have you have houses, and you have, let's say, sanitarium happening as well. Sydney Adventist Hospital. There is a business arm operating effectively to support the conferences or support the church as a body. You don't have that in the Pacific Islands.
Right.
Pacific Islands is all about stewardship, stewardship meetings, raising offerings and tithes for the church. Church is entirely dependent on that. So that does create dependency. So the question then is, could the church in the Pacific Islands be allowed to engage in business and therefore raise funds to support not only that church, but become more involved in local projects that can help the community? The other thing as well is that because church in the Pacific are dependent on members to fund it, sometimes they have to seek funds from the political system, from members of parliament who otherwise, it does raise the question, where do they get the money to give to the church? And so are these money meant for the church? Are these money appropriated properly? If some of the contributions coming from politicians to the church are somewhat accused of corruption, then it does raise the question, does church encourage that? So I think at the church managerial level, SPD level, there needs to be some hard discussions about where can we take the church from here, and therefore avoid some potential accusations going forward.
It's interesting that you mentioned the different attitudes and approaches to all of this, between the Pacific and somewhere like Australia. We have a question here from Tapua, and he says, how does this conversation affect the relations between the Australian Church and the Pacific Island Church? And then specifically, is the SPD ready for a president from the islands? What do you think?
Very good question. I think the first question, how does the Australian Church affect the Pacific? I think the Australian churches, and I've been seeing a lot of missions, from churches here, youth groups and churches supporting aid posts, health centers, schools in the Pacific, which is really great. And yes, Avondale, does some mission trips as well, and schools in Australia. So perhaps this is a good way to link the people to people understanding and also support some of the local communities. There is that established there. Whether or not that is effective, I haven't seen any research done on it. We've been doing missions for a long time, cross-country missions. Has there been a research on measuring the effectiveness? Probably that is something for scholars in the church to really consider. I think the second thing on the question of whether or not Pacific Island or a Pacific Island should occupy the head of church in the SPD, I think one good thing that comes out of the Floyd movement is raising the consciousness of inclusivity, of capacity, of capability of people of color. And if anything, probably our church can look at that and say, have we allowed enough inclusivity? Have we allowed diversity to become part of our church leadership? Is it time now to look at the Pacific and say, look, there's someone in there that we can appoint? I think these are questions that is relevant to this time, and I probably wouldn't give you a direct answer, but I think our church leaders who are viewing this seminar, for instance, might take this and say, you know, when it comes to the next committee meeting, should we diversify leadership within our church as an example of responding to the current issues of racial inclusivity, racial diversity.
Just following on from that, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation how this movement is also causing us to look at our past. And you know, myself, my grandfather was a missionary in Fiji and in Papua New Guinea. But in recent years, there has been a blowback against missionary endeavors from many, it seems, native populations. People have been questioning whether the missionary efforts pushed colonialism or allowed colonialism to happen on the backs. They sort of snuck in behind the missionaries. There's a lot of these questions being raised about the value or questioning, I guess, the history. And yet it seems like when the church in the SPD has had the most mission efforts, the church has been the healthiest or the most successful when some of those links are quite strong between the islands and Australia and New Zealand. So can you just speak to that, how, I guess, as a Pacific Islander yourself, missionaries are viewed currently, and perhaps some of the positives and the negatives that surround what was a very key part of our church, and then where can we go going forward? You know, there is some lament that because missionary, you know, a lot of missionaries come from within the Pacific to the Pacific now, which I think is fantastic, local missionaries, but it's almost like the Australian church has lost a sense of what it can do to help. So maybe where do we go from here? What's a good positive way to go forward? That was two big broad questions, but I hope you can follow what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah. First thing, I think the missionaries have been a fundamental element of church growth, of the spread of Christianity across the Pacific, have transformed societies from their way of life to I guess accepting grace and salvation. I mean, love and ultimately coming to know Jesus. So I think missionary, in terms of the movement of Christianity, of the Adventist Church, missionary has been very fundamental, and that we all recognize that. And the Pacific is also grateful, I think, acknowledging that. On the other hand, though, we must acknowledge that missionary or missionization went hand in hand with that colonization. So missionization allowed colonization to flourish. Colonization allowed missionization to penetrate. You see, so the fact that both has a parallel history in many communities, they do see missionaries as an agent of the colonial empire, of the colonial system. What that means is that although the missionaries were good people doing the good things, and many of them have lost their lives in the course of becoming, faithful soldiers of Jesus, the bad or the negatives of colonization were also painted on the missionaries, because people view them as agents of the colonial system.
Right.
And that's an unfortunate conclusion, but that was what it was back then. And I think that has also influenced some of the current thinking. Now, that definitely doesn't undermine the good work that missionaries have been doing. I think an important part, though, is that the missionaries didn't just go and come back. They trained the locals.
Yes.
And they set up institutions like the Pacific Adventist University or Fulton College, for instance, where these institutions are now chucking out indigenous missionaries to get out there and also continue the spreading of the word. So I don't think there is a negative push from the Pacific. It's just that Pacific see themselves as now capable of continuing their missionary work. Now, what can we do here in Australia then? I think what we can do here in Australia is not necessarily sending missionaries there, because Pacific already have the missionaries now. We have been there, we have set up institutions, and we've trained them. So we don't need to go in there. But what we can do is to empower them with the mechanisms, with the instruments and the tools, with the funds if we can, or with, let's say, trainings or other things that will better equip them to continue work in a system that they're familiar with, in a society where they understand the context much more than we do here. So I think there is still ways where Australia can help. We just need to find out those strengths and continue to support the mission workers who are hard at work out in those fields in the Pacific.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but in my role, this is just a personal reflection as well on that point that you made, Bal. In my role, I've been privileged to travel to the Pacific a number of times, to Papua New Guinea, to Fiji. And whenever I go to the Pacific countries, my faith is lifted. I'm inspired because of the hard work and the missionary spirit that I see on the ground. You know, I met a guy, we did a short, I took a picture with the caption of a man. We flew up to Oxapmin, which is right close to Irian Jaya, close to West Papua, and right in the highlands there. And we visited with the church there. And I saw a man and his wife, you know, short highland people, with perhaps 12-foot planks on their backs, planks of wood. And this guy and his even shorter wife were carrying these planks were 3 times their length, and they were carrying them to a place, I think they said it was 12 miles away, where they were building a church. You know, they were taking the wood plank by plank to build a church into an unentered area, into a new area. Yeah. And when I see that sort of story, when I hear of the faith of people like this in the Pacific, I actually think we in the West have a lot to learn from. Now the tables have turned. You know, we can be inspired, we can increase our commitment because of the commitment I see in our missionaries now, our real missionaries out in the field who, you know, they Papua New Guinea has something 800 languages or something like that. You know, these people aren't necessarily local to their area, but they're closer culturally in experiences to be able to minister to their brothers and sisters across the next valley or across the next mountain, and they're planting churches in those places. So, yeah, I think what you're saying is that the missionary spirit is alive and well in the Pacific.
Yes. And your story, I can relate, and many of the viewers out there who have experienced Pacific will definitely relate. Our missionaries out there, they're quite passionate.
Yes.
And with the little that they have, some of them, in fact, many of them are not paid by the church.
Yes.
They are actually volunteer missionaries, living by local church offerings, local church support, where they can find, but they're not paid by the local missions, but they are passionate about doing the good work. And many of them are also holding, 14, 15, 16 churches.
Yes.
They walk around 6 to 8 hours from one church to another, trying to look after the church members there. So there is definitely a lot of sacrifice given by these people. And like you said, the real missionary spirit is alive in them. And us here in Australia, I think can definitely learn from them as well. And I think,
do you feel, sorry, go finish your.
No, I guess not only just learning from the missionaries out there, but also asking us, how can we help best with them? And I think, the church have been doing well in many sectors, but there is definitely more ways out there that we can, I guess, get more to the community level, to the village level, and help those churches who are ministering to the people in such a remarkable way.
Yeah, I love the fact that you're trying to be practical, and I think we'll get more to that practical aspect later on in the conversation, as we like to do at Adventist Record. We try and make it practical. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Bal, more on a personal level, your personal experience. So as we were preparing for this discussion, Jared mentioned that there's actually quite a difference between the experience of Melanesian people and Polynesian people in places like Australia and New Zealand. Would you mind sharing a little bit about why that is, for people who aren't aware, as I wasn't, and also a bit about your experience and whether you feel, at home in Australia or at home back in Papua New Guinea, and whether there's conflict between the two?
Yeah, I think there is, with the race consciousness that we see, it does ask the question of how we ourselves as people of the Pacific have treated each other, and then whether there is racism within the Pacific itself. And it's an interesting point that you raise about Polynesian and Melanesian, because when it comes to color of a person from these two different areas, there is definitely difference. One is, Melanesians are a bit more darker, and Polynesians a bit more fairer. So there is that sense of, feeling that, hey, one looks a little bit more like the white Australian or white New Zealand. The other is not that. So I think that does raise some sense of a level of acceptance or not. So Melanesians coming to Australia or New Zealand felt like they're probably on the more fringes, I guess, struggling to fit into the more, to the Australian or New Zealand society that has a mostly white and white population. And then Polynesians, I suppose, the fact that they themselves, can identify as a fairer skin, and then their sense of affluency within Australia and New Zealand makes them a little bit more, I suppose, less inclined to be feeling indifferent. So that is something that is going on quietly, I suppose, in some sectors, and I'm sure Jared has noted about a recent research on that space, which I'm happy to listen in on. But what the Floyd, I guess the Floyd movement has brought about is a sense of unity, a sense of saying that the colored race needs inclusivity, needs a sense of consciousness here. So that, in some ways, break that internal differences, if there is, and saying, look, we are one people, we are the colored race, we on the fringes, can we demand a broader, a fairer stake? But it's interesting, Jared, you've noted research on that particular topic of pollination and melanation. So could you?
Yeah, if I can unpack a little bit of that. I think it was a Griffith University study on the Logan area where there's a lot of Polynesian people. My wife spent a bit of her upbringing in Logan in southeast Queensland. And I was actually studying trauma narratives in Pacific literature. So I was looking into different literature in the Pacific in Australia. Not very well represented is what I found. There's not a lot of Pacific literature. Like we were saying before, there seems to be a whole of Pacifica culture in our television screens, in our literature, etc. But basically the study found that it's been a little while, so let me get this right, hopefully. So Bal, you're aware that in places like Papua New Guinea, there's very low literacy rates, 60% or something like that in Papua New Guinea. And yet the Melanesian students that come to Australia have a much higher percentage and a much higher outcome of going on to do tertiary studies. So basically, the Polynesian nations, where there's a 96% literacy rate in Samoa and 94 in Tonga, something like that. And yet the students who are Polynesian in Australia have a much lower rate of getting into tertiary studies and then completing those tertiary studies. And I was just reflecting on some of that and whether or not there might be systemic injustices in, that we see in, for example, maybe it's harder for Melanesians to get into Australia. So it's only the top of the top, the best of the crop who actually have the power to go through and the wealth to go through university level studies and get through. And that's why they're better represented in some of those statistics, because Polynesians come much more easily into New Zealand and then into Australia. They don't have to strive, I guess, as hard to find jobs or to prove themselves in the same way that Melanesians do. Perhaps there's an issue there, and just like you said, perhaps. Although I still think there are issues in acceptance in mainstream culture and integration, then I think perhaps that there is a difference in treatment of the Polynesians and the Melanesian students. But certainly the students that really are struggling in this study, they were looking at the Polynesian students in Logan area, and there was a big gap between what was expected of them from Australian culture and what they understood from their Polynesian culture. And so they were falling into the gap. They were being poorly educated by the system because the system didn't meet their needs. Another example, I think, of systemic issues, the system is the issue. So not necessarily what we call intentional racism, but there was a gap in their educational outcomes. And so I think some of those things, when we look into them, they really highlight some of the challenges that our Pacific people face when they come to Australia.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point, and yeah, no, that's good on you to raise that. My earlier comment was on the racial, I guess, tensions or some of the potential racial indifferences between those groups,
Yes.
but how it played out in terms of the educational outcomes is a very interesting aspect. I, for one, I think experienced that in my studies as a high school student in Sydney, as a Melanesian student. And there were Polynesians and Micronesians students as well. And I think there is a level of level of commitment that one can say from the two different groups. So the Melanesians a bit, especially from my experience, I could see a bit more committed to their studies. And Polynesians are Polynesian students as well as from the cohort that I was in, they were quite great as well. It's just that I think the experience of me coming from the island straight to the school and trying to compete and trying to, break free from my poor background or from my village background and really make myself, make something out of my opportunity really pushes me. Whereas I guess those who are already here, and in that context, many of the Polynesian students who are already established in Australia, I think there's a sense of comfort already provided. So I guess that may have affected their level of commitment. And that is what I tend to observe in many of the Melanesian students as well. Those that I've spoken to, I think coming from the background that you have in your country to Australia gives you that challenge that you want to overcome.
Yes.
But that, though, I think doesn't take away from the fact that the challenge of parents, parents obviously, Melanesians or Polynesians, the parents have a similar, I think, have the same goal of wanting the best for their kids.
Right.
And while the kids' commitment may vary, the parents' commitment are quite steady in terms of wanting the best for their kids, and that brings home the issue that you raised. Is there systemic disadvantages or issues that we can explore that can allow for a fair representation, a much more inclusive representation, and therefore address issues that may be a distraction to the Pacific communities and their commitment to education or commitment to other things as they want to find a sense of identity here in Australia or New Zealand.
Is there a sense from those parents, Bal, like I guess parents of any race are keen to see their children do well, but is there a sense where the system or the parents feel like they either choose the culture or they choose their kids getting the best education? Is there a sense where parents are having to feel or to tell their children, hey, you know what, become Western, do English at home, we need you to succeed in education and occupation, rather than focusing on culture, because you need to, in a sense, reject that to make it in this country. You have to reject who you are, sort of who you have been in your past and in your heritage to make it through to success. Is there a sense of that at all in Pacific sort of families?
I think the Pacific families in Australia and New Zealand are struggling, knowing that there is a greater force out there trying to assimilate them and especially their kids into the Western standards and practices and expectations. And then the parents obviously trying to maintain some of the values of the Pacific society that identify who they are and make them to become who they are, and therefore instill that into their kids. So that is a real struggle, I would imagine, for the Pacific communities. For myself, I have a small daughter. Mom is New Zealand, and I'm from Papua New Guinea. So we are definitely, I guess for me, I'm trying to teach some of the language I speak in my mother tongue and trying to communicate. Some of the approach that I take, I want to maintain that level of, I guess, commitment to raising someone that will honor a culture that I represent, but also knowing fully that for that person to make it in terms of in their pursuits of education and to become part of a growing society that they are being expected to be part of, they have to, become part of this and allow some of the standards that I want to put into, also reduce that to them to an extent, to allow the Australian society or the standards here to influence. And I think there is no negative around it, there is no positive around it. It's just that level of balancing.
Right.
And I would think that the white families, white Australian families, white New Zealand families are also facing the similar challenge of, not all culture practices here are actually great. So there is a anxiety on other races and their parenting skills to make sure that kids are brought up in a very safe and respectable home. Yeah.
I guess as Christians, we're not of this kingdom, so we have our allegiance elsewhere. So we have to be in the world, but not of the world is what you're saying. So even no matter what race we come from, we are all wrestling with that our Christian commitment and our Christian calling and instilling that in our kids, passing that on to our children.
That's right. Which I think it's the ultimate thing, isn't it? We are not talking about races now. I think if we go beyond that, we're looking at the values and characters of what defines us as Christians against the world out there and all the challenges that it throws us. And I think when we are on that path, then everyone faces a similar challenge.
Yeah, for sure.
Do you think as we wrap up, sorry, Mary Ellen, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to, no, you go, it's fine.
No, I was just going to say, does the church have work to do as we finish up? What can the church do for Pacific Islanders? What do we as church members need to recognize and understand? And how can we live that out? Getting to the practical, the nitty-gritty of it. As an Adventist church, what can we do in this space and what can we do better?
I think, sorry, this is the start, Jared and Mel, what we're just having right here, right now. The conversation that you had last week with the Indigenous leaders. This is the start of a greater reform. We cannot always be complacent with status quo. There must come a time when institutions must be called upon to look deep within and ask some big questions. Complacency has its time, and then movements like this that is sweeping this world is asking some deeper questions of where are we in terms of our Christian commitment, our Adventist fundamentals, and how are we practically putting into our day-to-day church operation, taking into account the bigger issues that about racism, racial consciousness, diversity, inclusivity. And so this is the start of something big, and I think church should not let this be a waste, this pass. It's about time SPD at that level need to start saying, how can we improve things in terms of being more racial consciousness, in terms of church leadership, in terms of how we frame missionary and missionization across the region, allowing self-sufficiency for our missions across the region. How do we go about allowing them to be self-sufficient, a sense of independence, a sense of worth that they could feel? Or are we allowing them to just bandwagon and become reliant on a bigger mother movement, and therefore undermining their capacity, undermining their skills and their innovation? So I think Pacific would be expecting, those who are concerned with this kind of issues would be expecting our leaders in the church to stand up and start asking those bigger questions. The other thing, Jared, is that there are some issues in the Pacific that our church has been quiet on, whereas other churches have been quite vocal. And in some ways, we need to also look at that and ask the question: and are we as a church becoming a voice for our members in the Pacific, or are we only waiting for the head office in America to, I guess, instruct us on the path we should be following? I think there needs to be a bit more real awakening in terms of how we represent our members in the Pacific when they are confronted with issues of governance or issues of justice. Do we church stand up and make a call? And on that note, I want to commend the SPD leadership. I think last year made a statement on climate change, and it came out in the record. So that was a good start. I feel like that was a very good start in terms of leadership saying climate change is important in the Pacific, and we as a leadership body will take the call here. I'd like to see more of that happening in many other sectors of challenge in the Pacific. Some of that standing up will be contrary to what Australia and New Zealand official position is.
Yes.
So, for instance, climate change.
You're talking about the government's position. Yes. The church might have to say, "Hey, this is important to us."
That's right. So some of the positions that the church take might be contrary to the official position that the government take, which influence our church members here. So you might have a tension there with members in Australia and New Zealand having a contrary view to what the needs are in the Pacific and what the SPD can ultimately do at that level. And I can see tensions there developing where there is that contrary positions between the official positions here and what the church at that level need to do to represent the Pacific plight. So that's something that our church members here in Australia and New Zealand needs to be on board, and more conversation needs to have that we don't have to always agree with the government. Our governments here, we need to, I guess, have an objective take on issue, and church needs to operate objectively and fearlessly in pursuing some of the causes of the Pacific people.
Yeah, wow. Well, let's just hope that going forward, starting with the Black Lives Matter movement and all these conversations that we've had, that some of those things can take place. But I think we've sort of reached the end of our time that we have. Is there any comments that you'd like to leave us with? Anything you haven't said, Bal, that you just really want to get out, or you're okay?
No, thank you, Mel. I think Martin Luther King was quite instrumental in coining a prophetic statement, a timeless statement, in that that my children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And that statement continued to reverberate across decades in all sectors, in all institutions and governments. And I think in the context of our conversation today, that statement should also have its rightful place in our church. In that we are to ask, or we are to speak out on issues, ask the big questions, so that our members are not feeling discriminated or feeling sense of otherness in this one big family. That we judge, or we are not to judge, I suppose, but we value our people on the content of their faith, on their commitment as a disciple of this movement for Christ, and therefore giving them opportunities, allowing them to shine in their capacities. That church has been great. I, as an Adventist living here from Papua New Guinea, haven't experienced racism or anything of that sort within the church. I think the church community here in Australia, and I'm not speaking from New Zealand, but here in Australia, I think has been quite aware of its mission to the greater gospel of loving and merciful God that we serve. But that does not mean that there are others out there who have a similar experience as me. Perhaps they may be feeling a sense of racial indifferences. And so I think for us, church, we need to rise up in this movement to really say, look, am I being a good church? Am I being an inclusive church? Am I being a race-conscious church? Both at the local level, conference level, union level, and I think the division level. Those questions need to come home. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bal,
for joining us. Yeah, it was a really great discussion. We've had some comments from a lot of people saying how important this discussion is and how it's great that it's out in the open, and yeah, very needed at this time, people are saying. So you've definitely helped and educated us on some very important things that I certainly wasn't aware of. And for everyone watching this in the future, if you have any more questions for Bal or just questions in general, do comment below and we will get back to you at some stage soon. But yeah, thanks again, Bal, and all the best. We will see you again. Well, not you, Bal, but we'll see everyone else again next week.
Thank you, Mel.
Bal,
thank you, Jared.
Thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and we hope to see some more of your articles in Record soon.
Yes, no, I think it is high time to write one.
Excellent.
Two, or no, we'll see. But no, thank you so much for having me on board, and all the best with your great work.
Thank you, Bal.